War Years, which was written about 1946, a few months after we were liberated, and well, the memories were still quite fresh, but also there was some family history and so on. And sometime along, I don't know, way back when, a long time ago, David Colley heard about this. And David actually wrote an article that appeared in the Morning Call in December 1981, which I happen to have kept, and I'll pass around. And you can see this young physics professor was me a few years ago. One of the problems with the, of course, David is a legitimate historian. I am absolutely not. But one of the problems with World War II history is anybody who was actively fighting in World War II is now in their 90s, right? Mm-hmm. And so you better get them quick, folks, because they're dropping off. Okay. I also want to say there are a number of books. This book, Richard Marzulli put me onto just a few months ago. It's a current book, a new book, and it's called Rampage, and it's all about MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, and his opposite number, a Japanese general named Yamashita, and the battle for Manila, which was a bloody, bloody business, as David knows. The Japanese were brutal, I mean barbaric, unbelievably barbaric, for no good reason, when it came especially to dealing with Filipino civilians and also prisoners of war, military prisoners. They were much easier, tough enough on civilian internees like us, but much tougher on the Filipino civilians. Okay, and this book, which is hardly my favorite, it's rather dull reading actually by a military historian, but is of interest in that it has a list of all the internees in the back, including our family, and on page 174 you will find David Hogenboom, now a professor of physics. It turns out that this author didn't read my dad's account, but he read David Colley's article, and so if you can see what so David made me famous. Okay, so what I want to do is to try to fill in a little bit about the background, how we got into this mess anyway, and then the climax of the story is the actual liberation event itself, February 23rd, 1945. My younger daughter Emily calls me every Liberation Day. Hi, Dad, it's Liberation Day. And leading up to that, and when we get to that point, I thought I would read my dad's account of it. Since he was there, all these other people are reading it from people who they've talked to who had experienced the event. Okay, so how did we get over there? Well, my father was a Presbyterian minister. He had gotten a Master of Theology from Princeton Seminary, took a church in Pikeville, Kentucky, where I was born. He and my mother, I think, were married in 1933, and I guess they had talked about going into mission work for some time, and an opportunity presented itself. They were invited to become missionaries, and they decided, okay, let's do it. Well, this was now 1939. War was brewing in Europe, but they were talking about going to the other side of the world, right? So I guess it wasn't seen at that time anyway as such a scary proposition. Little did they know what they were going to be getting into. Anyway, we sailed from Vancouver, British Columbia. This is actually a car antenna, I guess. And we sailed to, and the ship, soon after leaving British Columbia, which is of course Canada and part of the British Empire, they painted the ship gray because England was involved with the hostilities in Europe, but the U.S. was not, although we were providing a lot of munitions and so on to the forces in Europe. And we sailed to Manila, which is in the island of Luzon. This is a map of the Philippines. I was telling Carolyn, I guess. you know, you kept this thing rolled up for some time. This is the first time it's ever been used by me, and maybe the last time it's ever been used by anyone. So anyway, but we went to Manila, which is right here, capital of the Philippines. And Philippines is maybe 300 or 400 miles, I guess, south of Japan, north of which at the time of the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. And rather quickly, my folks were posted down to the island of Leyte, the town of Tacloban. You may have heard of Tacloban a few years ago, actually, a time of a horrible typhoon that rolled in from the east, crossed the island of Samar, and really devastated Tacloban. The main reason for going down there was because of a hospital. My mother was a trained nurse and was well prepared to take over as head of nursing in this hospital in Tacloban. And my dad did whatever missionary preachers do, I guess, set up small churches in the hinterland. There was another missionary there, a man named Ernest Fry, who actually was a U.S. citizen, but also a citizen of Switzerland. He had dual citizenship. And Ernest Fry was able to keep his Swiss citizenship, and Switzerland, of course, was neutral during the war, and he managed to stay out of internment camps the entire war. Okay, well, for 2 years, from fall of 1939 on through until December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, my folks lived a relatively peaceful life. War clouds were developing, however. Japan invaded China, and there was some question. I've often wondered, we were over there, and I've often wondered if my father had been married to somebody like my wife Anne instead of my mother, things might have been a little bit different. I mean, I could see if Anne were there, she might say, "Look, Bucko, we're going to take these boys and get home. We're not going to stay out here where things are threatening." But in fact, Pearl Harbor occurred as a massive shock to everyone, and we were trapped. I mean, there was no leaving for the U.S. after that. With the idea that the Japanese were going to be arriving in, the Japanese took Manila rather quickly, but the question was, were they going to go on down through the rest of the Philippines or not? And it wasn't clear, and so we decided to take to the hills, basically. We moved from Tacloban to a village called Barawan, maybe 25 miles up a road in the mountains. But a road from Tacloban to Barawan could be taken by Japanese troops just as well as us, and so it was quickly regarded that wasn't going to be very safe. And so we moved on up to a village of Tuluyao. Now, I was just a little kiddie when we went over there in 1939. I was actually born in 1936, so I was not quite 3 when we went over there. You won't hear any recollections from that far back. But I do, my very first memories were of heading up to the hills of Tuluyao on the back of a carabao. A carabao is a water buffalo, used all over the Philippines as a beast of burden, much as oxen were maybe 150 years ago in this country. So carried all this stuff up. You could only get up to Tuluyao by footpath or carabao path. So we got up there, but Ernest Fry stayed in Tacloban, and my dad got word from him and others, and finally decided this was not such a bright idea. If the Japanese had to hunt us down, there's a spine of mountains down the center of Leyte, but they're not really rugged mountains. And so if the Japanese had really wanted to, they probably could have found us, number one. So
I have a quick question. How many people were in your party? Was it just your family?
It was really just our family at that point, yeah. We knew there were Filipinos that we knew, people connected with the hospital and so on, but we were the only Americans. The number one, it wasn't going to be good for us to get caught if the Japanese had to put a lot of effort into doing this. Number two, and maybe most important, the families, Filipino families that would have been involved in sending us from place to place or hiding us would not have fared very well. And so it was thought, like it or not, the best thing to do was to go down to Tacloban and be there when the Japanese arrived, and that's what they did. So we went down there and essentially were ready to surrender. The Japanese arrived. They were rather gentlemanly, explained that, an officer explained that we would have to be interned, of course, but no rough stuff, nothing terrible. And shortly we were put in a provincial jail. I mean, Tacloban was the capital of the province of Leyte. And this place I also have some authentic but dim memories of. And it was really an incredibly bad hole. I mean, it was awful. And I won't go into detail about the bathroom facilities or lack of them and so on. But that was a miserable place. But on the other hand, and this actually through my dad's account, you get, you know, good Japanese and bad Japanese. There was an officer there, a man named Lieutenant Santa, who took a liking to these two little boys. My brother was maybe 5, I guess I was 5, he was 7 by that time, he was 2 years older than I. In fact, they brought us some toys to play with, and he seemed like a very decent sort of guy, you know. Probably had a family in Japan, didn't speak any English to speak of, but that's okay. So, and then after a while, my mother, my brother and I were allowed to leave the jail and go live with the Fries, and my father was kept interned. There were a number of other Americans in and around Leyte, maybe a dozen or 15 or so. And so this was now early 1942, Pearl Harbor right at the end of 1941. And we actually surrendered in, I guess, May of 1942, so from the middle of 1942 onward. We were interned one place or another in Tacloban. We were staying, my mother and brother and I were staying with the Fry family. A Japanese photographer took this picture. My brother Steve is up on a swing with Elizabeth Fry, and I'm down here, the lady, with Joanne, an older Fry daughter. And that's while we were staying with them in Tacloban. And my dad was moved to out of the jail into a school, and then later my mother and brother and I were able to join him, which turned, you know, my mother rather liked that. She had a little trouble getting along with Ernest Fry. But anyway, so that took us really through 1942. Not a lot of, and we were able, we were fed. The Fries had they call it a houseboy, a man named Tito, who worked for them and was able to bring us hot meals. And you know, life could have been worse. Then, toward the end of 1942, word came that all foreign nationals were to be sent back to Manila and interned in a large concentration camp in Manila called Santo Tomas. So we had to get on a boat. This is a kind of an inter-island steamer. My dad said it was an old ship. If there was a headwind, the ship could actually had to drop an anchor. They could not make way against the wind. My dad used to like to tell a particular story because, again, we were up on deck and they spread blankets to shield us from the sun. And then it started to rain, and there was a wind. And even though this is a tropical country, you know, it's not very cold at night. Still, it was cold up on the deck of the ship, and this was not going very well. And my brother and I were not happy. And so my dad said, "Okay, there's a steamship. There has to be some heat somewhere down below decks." And even though we weren't permitted to go below decks, he opened the door, and we went on down and just sort of camped out in a hallway down there where at least it was warm. And a Japanese petty officer who spoke no English whatever saw us there and actually, again, took pity on the two little boys and took us to his cabin. And turns out he had a family in Japan. He couldn't really communicate, didn't speak any English, but communicated well enough. And so we spent the rest of the night there, and then he found another place on the ship. And my dad loved to tell this story as, again, you know, a good Japanese guy. He seemed very understanding and easy to deal with. That took us to Manila. Once in Manila, we were taken by bus to Santo Tomas Internment Camp. Santo Tomas was an ancient university, about the age of Harvard. It's been there a long, long time. Walled-in campus compound. We went in there and were just dumbfounded. This place, I mean, people were relaxed, sitting around. This was the cream of Manila. I mean, there were a lot of American and British and other nationalities, people who were running corporate businesses, you know, people with considerable responsibility. And the Japanese had the good sense to let the camp organize itself. So there was a committee elected to represent all the internees. A man named Carol Grinnell, who was, I think, a Far East representative for General Electric, was the head of that committee. And food was brought in. Food was relatively plentiful. Filipinos could come to the camp and actually, and internees had money because they could get money passed to them also. And so everything, I mean, there were professional entertainers. They had concerts in the evening, people playing musical instruments and giving recitals. It was, you know, like a summer resort, right? And, I thought, well, this isn't so bad. It's better than in a jail in Tacloban anyway. So that was in early 1943. My dad actually was given a position of considerable responsibility. He became a building monitor. They had some large old buildings and with a large room, maybe it had been a gymnasium. The main problem with San Tomas was crowding. There were an awful lot of people in a limited space. And so my dad was a building monitor, and this is for women and children who were staying in this one building. And so many square feet were allotted to each internee, and it was an area of 4 by 8, right? You know, a 4 by 8 piece of plywood, not very large. So that had to be the internee's cot. Possessions had to go underneath, and then you could sort of walk through, and a mosquito net over the cot, and that was basically it. And so people were continually jockeying for extra space, and my dad had a lot of problems to solve with all this. Carol Grinnell, things got much tougher in San Tomas later on, and the food became less plentiful, and we left San Tomas and went to Los Baños a little later, but just to stay with San Tomas for just a bit. This committee had to serve as an interface between the Japanese and the internees. And so sometimes they had difficult decisions to make. And as things got more difficult, as food became more scarce and people started to approach starvation, apparently some internees decided that this committee was not really representing them as, well, they were entirely too condescending to the Japanese. In fact, my dad, in his account, says that Carol Grinnell was referred to as a white Jap at one point. But to give an idea of just whose side he was on, in early 1945, well after we had left San Tomas, you don't know what the dispute was, but the Japanese leadership decided that they didn't trust Carol Grinnell, and he and 2 other members of this committee were beheaded. So and by that, you know, that was clear which side he was on. But anyway, okay, so we left Santo Tomas in April of 1944. There were about 800 men were taken from Santo Tomas and set to work building another camp in a town called Los Baños, which was about 35 miles southeast of Manila, within just a mile or two of a rather large inland lake called Laguna de Bay, and with a rather picturesque mountain rising on the other side of the camp called Mount Makiling. So these men built barracks of bamboo for framing and nipa thatch, which is the kind of a palm thatch for a roof, to house internees. And the idea was to have another camp that would serve as an internment camp, taking some of the pressure off the crowding in Santa Tomas. So, and my folks decided families were allowed to make the choice to move to Los Baños, and my dad and mother decided that was going to be a smart thing to do, and turned out to be an excellent decision. They got there and found life was much more relaxed. Again, as in the early days with Santa Tomas, there were Filipinos around who were able to bring food. I mean, the Filipinos is a tropical country, very fertile. I mean, there are bananas, papayas, and mangoes, and guavas, and all kinds of fruit and vegetables, and no doubt slaughtered carabao for meat, and so on. So early on, food was relatively plentiful, and life was quite good. Now, of course, you know any World War II history, you know by 1944, the U.S. was actually winning the war. But we were dimly aware of that. There were rumors that would filter into camp. In any case, we were not winning. We were behind barbed wire fences. So, but early on, things were not that difficult in Los Baños. That was until, say, we moved there in April, about August or maybe September of 1944. A young Japanese officer came, a man named Konishi, Sadaki Konishi, a lieutenant, and he was a warrant officer, whatever that meant. Actually, he was second in command in the camp. He came from Los Baños. If the officer on board ship and the kindly officer at the Tagloban jail were examples of Japanese that you could deal with and like children and so on. Konishi was the exact opposite. This man was an absolute bastard. He just went out of his way to be cruel and tough on internees. He simply hated Americans, and every chance he got, he made life difficult for internees. So dealing with him was not pleasant, and he immediately cut the food ration down. He made it more difficult for Filipinos to bring food in from outside, and things went progressively downhill from, say, September of 1944 onward. There were bright spots. On September 21st, 1944, date comes from my dad, I wouldn't have known. We saw the first American airplanes. Wow. And you know, you can read all the books you want, but there's no way you can really describe the sound of a fleet of bombers flying at high altitude. And I well remember that throbbing, sound. It was very exciting. And the best thing was they were all flying north toward Japan, right? So there were these large flights of B-24 bombers with P-38 escorts. We did learn to identify the different, we could tell B-25 from B-26 and the P-38 from P-51 and so on. And so it was very exciting and helped lift spirits. Also, P-38 bombers, fighter planes actually strafed, that is, flying low and shooting with machine guns on either vehicles on the road, or there was also a railroad that ran along the coast of the lake. And we saw some of that, and another memory I had was climbing an acacia tree with my brother, and some of the other kids in the camp climbed another tree to try to get a better look at these planes. Well, we were spotted by a Japanese guard, and this was strictly forbidden. I don't know, they thought we were signaling or what we were going to do, but anyway. So they came after us. My brother and I got out of that tree just as fast as we possibly could, and got back to the little cubicle that we lived in. The other kids were caught, but just given a scolding, fortunately. They were taken to the commandant's office, and he gave them a kind of a stern lecture, I guess, but nothing worse than that. But that was an exciting event. Okay. Now, another thing that I remember was in the evening, this now got into 1945. I mean, food was running increasingly shorter and shorter, and people were getting hungrier and hungrier. But you know, for kids, it wasn't as I mean, my parents, I'm sure, went through a lot of
Where did the
torment.
food come from? The Filipinos brought you all food into the camp?
The Filipinos would bring food to the camp, and there was an allotment of rice. I mean, we were given I mean, there were 2,000 people there, you know, so it's a sizable population, and they had food lines. They had to get firewood to build fires to cook the rice. They made a kind of a mush they called lugao. So it was a combination of food brought in by Filipinos and also rice provided by the Japanese for the camp to eat. But they kept cutting back on the rations. In I guess somewhere near the 1st of February, Manila became under attack. MacArthur did return to the Philippines as he vowed he would. MacArthur had been on Corregidor and escaped to Australia. He was actually ordered to leave the Philippines. Feeling being that it would be a great propaganda coup if General MacArthur, who was the best known soldier in the world at that time, was to be captured. So he managed to get out and he vowed to return, and he did. And the American fleet, after fighting a terrific battle, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was a landmark victory for U.S. forces, they moved up the coast of Luzon and invaded Lingayen Gulf. I don't know whether that's Lingayen Gulf or where, but northern Luzon, and then proceeded to fight their way down through Luzon. Apparently MacArthur heard rumors that Japanese could execute prisoners, including civilian prisoners, and so he sent an armored, what unit you would call it, but anyway, and they moved rapidly through Filipino lines into Manila and liberated Santa Tomas internment camp, except liberation meant they killed the guards and so on, could take possession, but there was no place to take them. I mean, you know, but the internees were freed for their well. But then the Battle of Manila ensued after that, and so much of late January and February 1945, Manila burned. From Los Baños, 35 miles away, we could see clouds of smoke. And I remember standing out in the evening in the barracks, and you would see a flash, and these men would count the number of seconds, until you would hear a crump, the explosion that caused the flash. And you've probably done this with thunderstorms. You see a flash of lightning, and you can count the number of seconds until you hear the thunder, and divide by 5, and they'll give you the number of miles. It wasn't until later on I realized that the speed of sound is about 1,100 feet per second, or a fifth of a mile. So if sound travels about a fifth of a mile per second, it travels a mile in 5 seconds, right? And so if whereas light travels 186,000 miles per second, so that goes bingo. And so you see the flash, and then you divide the interval by 5, and you get the number of seconds that it takes, so you can figure how far away the explosion occurred. And the little calculation that people did concluded that these flashes were coming from Manila. They never seemed to get that much closer, however. Okay. We're wrapping up. Another memory I had was about this same time, probably January 1945. I was walking in the camp down some kind of road, and I heard rifle shots. Rifle or whatever, anyway, shots. And I got back to our cubicle, and we found out that an internee that we all knew, he had been a gardener, a man named Pat Hell, kind of interesting last name, but had been shot actually coming back into, and killed, coming back into the camp. He had gone out as possible actually to get under the barbed wire fence, one area of the camp was close to a ravine, and there was vegetation enough so people could sneak out. And he had made contact with Filipinos and tried to arrange to have food brought back. And he was coming back to the camp, actually, when he was spotted and killed. And total violation of Geneva Convention and so on. He was not escaping, he was coming back and so on. All right, well, that was Kenichi and his work. And there was another man just a couple days later who was shot in similar circumstances and wounded. And there was a doctor in the camp, Dr. Nance, who tried to get to him. And the Japanese would not let him, let them touch him. And later he was taken and executed. So they could be very tough. All right, food is running out. It was projected that the rice allotment would actually disappear on February 19th. Okay? At that time, what the Japanese did was then start giving people palai. Palai is if the rice grain itself, as it comes from the plant, is surrounded by a husk, and the Filipinos would husk the rice by putting it in a hollowed out pole in a log or a large chunk of wood, and with poles smash it until you would bust up these husks. And then Filipino women developed the art of sifting it with a breeze blowing. In a shallow basket, they would shake the rice up and down, and the shaft would blow out, and they would get the rice. Well, not many internees learned that art, and so they would actually pick with tweezers, grain by grain, because by that time people were really getting hungry. Another problem with starvation is that vitamin B deficiency caused people to develop beriberi. The man in the cubicle right next to us, a man named Brink, and I remember seeing his leg propped up on a stool or something, and his leg was swelled up about 3 times normal size, which is a normal consequence of beriberi. Okay, well, among the people who managed to get out of the camp, there were 3 single men. One is named Ben Edwards, another man named Pete Miles, and a third guy named Freddie Zervalakis. And Miles and Edwards in particular are referred to, I think, in all these books. Miles in particular had an excellent memory, and he was able to get out of the camp and draw and make contact with Filipino guerrillas. Between the camp and Mount Makiling, there were many Filipino guerrillas. That is, there were Filipinos who just hated the Japanese, but organized in different kinds of bands. So these guys escaped from the camp during the night, were able to make contact with guerrillas, and Miles and Edwards in particular actually got all the way to American lines. And made contact with American intelligence forces. And Miles was able to draw a map, a detailed map of the camp showing location of the Japanese guardhouses or pillboxes. He also knew and relayed the fact that at 7 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese did calisthenics. And that meant that these guards would come in and they would stack their weapons in a particular location and then go over here and do their calisthenics. MacArthur had heard that that there were atrocities, that the Japanese were capable of atrocities. And it may have been, you mentioned Palawan, down here, where actually there was a camp. I think they may have been military personnel who were about a couple hundred or so, who were really just executed in a barbaric fashion. So there were rumors around that that could happen to us. The rumors actually reached American forces, and American intelligence believed that, in fact, it's a real possibility, and it could happen soon. So this added pressure to develop a plan to rescue these poor people in Los Baños internment camp, which was the second largest camp after Santa Tomas, which had already been liberated. So a plan was developed, and that is the subject of this particular picture on the handout. This shows Laguna de Bay here, and the railroad running up along the coast and Route 1. And the operation which was devised was rather complicated. An artillery group was sent up here to block Route 1 because there were Japanese troops in the area, significant numbers of Japanese troops. There was a detachment of paratroopers who did not actually jump from the plane, but a reconnaissance platoon that was dispatched ahead of time. The night of the 22nd, before the 23rd, they were to take positions just outside the camp, and they were assigned different Japanese sentry points and pillboxes to cover. A third aspect were the paratroopers themselves, which were going to drop at a site just outside the camp, a matter of a few hundred yards outside the camp. I think that brings us to the climax of the story. And rather than reading accounts from these gentlemen who have heard stories from other people, I thought I would read just a bit of my dad's account of it. So this was now early morning of February 23rd, 1945. Toward morning, I was lying awake with my mind in the old familiar squirrel cage of trying to answer the question, what shall we do? It seemed like being caught in a maze from which there was no exit. As I lay in bed, as I lay there under my mosquito net, I gradually became aware of a sound of engines. The sound was very faint and far away. At first I thought it was made by planes, but we had heard many planes before, and this sound was different. It was too constant to be planes. For a time I could hear it only when I lay with my head under my pillow. When I sat up, it was gone. Then gradually it came stronger and nearer. Finally I arose and went to the front door of the barracks. My idea was to judge the direction of the sound more accurately, and also to see if the Japanese guards were paying any attention to it. It was just beginning to grow light. I saw a couple of guards pass, returning from their sentry posts, and I could not detect any unusual excitement in their behavior. At 6:30, I heard someone arousing the Japanese soldiers who slept in barracks number 4 just across the road. It was the usual morning routine, and the soldiers began their customary chant, which accompanied their calisthenics. I learned to count to 8 in Japanese by hearing these guards, ichi, ni, san, si, go, ro, ikak, they were doing jumping jacks or what they were doing. But, anyway, that's the way you count to 8 in Japanese. I decided that the sound, whatever it was, must originate from Japanese equipment, and since it was coming in our direction, it indicated a withdrawal of Japanese forces. This in itself was good news. Bunny Chambers and 2 or 3 other men joined me at the doorway. I was actually there too. He didn't realize that, I guess. Okay. The time was nearing 7 o'clock when we were due to line up for our morning roll call. The gong had already sounded. I guess they sounded a gong, and when suddenly we saw coming from the north a close flying formation of about 15 planes. There were actually only 9, but they looked like 15 to him. Anyway, my first thought was that they were bombers in search of whatever we had been hearing, probably tanks or tractor-drawn artillery. Then Bunny Chambers cried out, "Those planes are not bombers, they're transports." He had no more than said it when the planes, now in plain view against the eastern sky, suddenly discharged paratroopers. I never hoped to see the equal of that picture. The sky was full of opening parachutes. Scores and scores of white parachutes with little black shapes dangling from them, silhouetted against the blue and rose and gold of that tropical sunrise. As the realization of what I was looking at dawned upon me, my first thought was, Ruth and the boys must see this too. I dashed back into the barracks, shouting their names, but found that they were already up and had gone outside the side door in time to see the same sight. In fact, I saw them. I snuck out there in front with him, I guess. Okay, we came back into the cubicle and began hurriedly dressing. We said, this is it. There will be shooting in a very few minutes. We had scarcely more than said it when rifle fire broke out on the other side of the camp toward the mountain. Beside our barracks, we had dug a drainage ditch several months before. We had made it far deeper than necessary with the idea in mind that at some time a convenient shelter might be a good thing to have. I grabbed a couple of pieces of old oilcloth which lay handy, threw them into the ditch, and told the boys to jump in. Ruth and I followed them into the ditch, for bullets were buzzing over our heads like bees in an orchard in June. My father's a bit given to cliche, but they zipped through our NEPA barracks and whined away into the distance. The P-38s wheeled and dived just above the barracks, and a great transport plane, a C-47, banked sharply, showing the word rescue lettered in white on the fuselage. There was constant rifle fire and heavier explosions on all sides. The heavier explosions were no doubt hand grenades, which this reconnaissance platoon was equipped with, and they were taking out these guard posts. Ruth had been appointed first aid representative for our barracks, and we expected at any moment to hear the cry of someone hit by a stray bullet, in which case we both would have gone to see what could be done. But no one in our barracks was hurt. As we lay there in the ditch, we had time to laugh at the reaction of the boys. I had expected them to be close to hysterics, such an event ever occurred. But instead, here was Dave griping because Steve got his muddy feet in his face. We decided they were taking it okay. I saw Charlie Miller, who was a professional photographer, dashing from one barracks to another with a camera. Since such articles were strictly prohibited by the Japanese, I wondered how many searches Charlie had successfully evaded. After perhaps 20 minutes of shooting, there came a lull, and raising our heads, we saw Filipino guerrillas running through the camp. Almost immediately afterward, we saw American soldiers. Their uniforms were utterly strange. The shape of their helmets resembled nothing we'd ever seen before. They were used to World War I sort of flat helmets. These were World War II helmets. We climbed out of the ditch and ran through the barracks just in time to see a great rumbling vehicle clanking up the roadway between our barracks and number 15, the one housing the offices. I could see at a glance that it had been in water, for seaweed was still clinging to the sides. It was an Amtrak, stands short for amphibious track vehicle, or amphibious troop carrier. In a few moments, the order was relayed through the barracks: prepare to leave at once. The camp is to be evacuated. We took time merely to put on the most serviceable clothes and shoes we had left, throw a few things into a suitcase, and we were ready to leave. Ruth mixed a half-pound or so of powdered milk with water, gave each of the boys a good drink, and passed the rest over to the Brinks, who lived right next door to us. This was powdered milk, which my mother had hoarded. They also hoarded tins of corned beef. They bought it in San Tomas when food was plentiful, and they kept it when food was no longer plentiful. They called it klim, which is milk spelled backwards, and this was stuff mixed with water, made a perfectly nourishing milk drink. Okay, I called the boys back into the cubicle, and for a moment we stood together to let the realization sink in that we were at last leaving prison. Then we hurried down the road to the athletic field where we had been ordered to assemble. Barracks were blazing on both sides of the road. These books explain that one of the problems, the U.S. military realized that this was behind enemy lines, right? So the idea was to get these internees loaded up in these Amtraks and get them out of there. But to the internees, you know, here were the Americans. The all-powerful American Army had arrived, and everybody was celebrating and having a great time and so on, and not moving. So somebody decided, the officer in charge decided the thing to do was set fire to these barracks. And so the American troops set fire to the barracks. That got the internees out and moving. Barracks were blazing on both sides of the road. Rifle fire still crackled in the ravine southwest of the camp. We passed Aunt Olive Rohrbaugh and helped her with her baggage. We had grown deeply attached to her during the months that she had been receiving her noonday meal from our kettle. Olive Rohrbaugh was a missionary lady who ended up living in Worcester, Ohio, and both my brother and I roomed with her. We called her Aunt Olive while we were, part of the time when we were in college. On all sides were Filipinos dressed in all kinds of rags and tatters, but everyone clutching some kind of weapon. The little fellow with the submachine gun told me he had just killed a Japanese under a banana tree close by. We reached the athletic field, and there we saw 50 or 60 of the Amtraks drawn up in rows with their ramps let down. One end of the Amtrak would drop down. They were designed to carry like a platoon of soldiers or maybe 35 to 50 internees. And the roar of their engines left no doubt as to the origin of the sound I had heard during the latter part of the night. They had crossed one corner of Laguna de Bay, coming around the end of the rather vague line of battle somewhere near Santa Rosa. Most of the Amtraks had some kind of picture or insignia painted on them. One of them flew a tiny American flag at the top of its radio mast. People were understandably crazy, and waves of cheering broke out for any reason at all. We lost little time in climbing aboard. The ramps were raised and we were off. It was still only a little after 9 o'clock. We went out through the university campus. The sergeant in charge of the Amtrak that we were riding in caught sight of Steve trying to stretch his neck to see over the sides. "Here," he cried, "put that boy up here so we can see where he's going." With one swing, he hoisted him up to the driver's seat. Davy perched up on the side of the vehicle beside him. The 4 men composing the Amtrak crew were a fine, happy-go-lucky lot. All the American soldiers impressed us as being tremendously big. Only later did we realize that it was because we had been accustomed to seeing only men in uniform who were about 5 feet 2. But at the time, these Americans seemed 9 feet tall, and they all looked so fat. They also looked so yellow in the account that they were all taking an anti-malaria drug called Adabrin, and it turned people yellow. And so I was struck by that, I remember. Okay. As the column of Amtraks moved on down toward the lake shore, there was a sudden spatter of sniper fire from the coconut trees bordering the road. Quick as a flash, our laughing sergeant had popped the boys down into the body of the vehicle and swung his .50 caliber machine gun into position, and with those in the other Amtraks sent a curtain of steel flying through the trees in the direction from which the shots came. We were crouched in the bottom directly below the breech of the machine gun, so that the hot cartridge cases that came popping out of the breech of the gun fell all around us. Ruth received a burn on the arm. I was nicked in the forehead, and one of the Wheeler boys squealed as the hot metal touched him. It was all over in a few moments, and the column resumed its advance to the lake. Without any hesitation, they moved out into the water, and probably looking back, we saw that we were at sea. The long line of Amtraks churning up the blue water of the lake made a great picture as they set our course for the point from which they had started in the early hours of the morning. We were glad to learn later that in the operation connected with our release, not a single man who jumped lost his life. This was an amazing operation, and the 11th Airborne was amazingly proud of it for several reasons. One, it was successful, and all such missions were not. It was a rather highly complicated thing. A lot of books, one of these books talks about Colin Powell bragging about this operation, and said it's taught in military history classes now. But the other thing was that whereas these paratroopers were hardened troops used to killing people, here they were being a humanitarian mission, really helping people that needed help. So, I secured the names and addresses of the 4 crew members of our Amtrak and promised to write to their mothers or wives after reaching the States. This I did and received grateful replies from all of them. The trip across the lake took about 2 hours. The Amtraks climbed up on the beach and discharged passengers. On the back side of the handout, you see what Amtraks actually looked like. They were tracked vehicles, so superficially they looked a little bit like tanks, but they were a hollow space in the middle where troops could stand. You can see the machine guns. These are actually picture taken from the event. And then down below you see internees wandering around here with rather ancient-looking ambulances and a jeep taking people. One of the things that turned out to be easier for the mission than anticipated. The people who escaped gave word that maybe a quarter of the camp, some 500 people, might be incapable of walking due to advanced starvation or illness. But in fact, there were only about 150 people. Some of these people were not in great shape, but they could skip and jump down to get in the Amtraks. Okay. Some of the Amtraks made a second trip to bring out internees who had been left behind in the morning. And to bring back the troops who had been holding the perimeter around the camp during the day. In fact, my dad was separated from us. My mother and my brother and I went on to the first contingent, and my dad waited with some other men, and said that people who had been protecting the the retreat and came later. There were a number of Japanese in the area, but apparently they never really caught on to what was going on or not in time to do anything about it. As the trucks took us from the beach to Muntinlupa, which was back up in the direction toward Manila, back behind American lines, we passed through several towns in which Filipinos lined the roads, giving the V for victory sign and shouting their greeting. Some of the towns had victory arches welcoming the American troops. We learned that the Japanese retreating through these towns within the preceding day or two had massacred civilians in tragic numbers, and afterwards even worse. There were apparently reprisals, the feeling that this camp had been liberated, and many of the Japanese just assumed that all Filipinos were hostile, and there was terrible loss of life as a result. Finally, our trucks drew up before the gray stone towers of the new Bilibid prison, or in this village of Muntinlupa. This prison had been nearing completion at the outbreak of the war. As we left the trucks, we lined up for registration. Each one of us was given a bar of chocolate, and cigarettes, or tobacco. I did do a little smoking, I guess. I never learned to smoke, but anyway, I remember that. Okay, preparation for our arrival had been hurriedly made, all of which bothered us very little. The sight of the American flag waving above the administration building was all that we wanted. With that, we were liberated. Just a bit of epilogue, we stayed in this camp, well fed by American forces for about a month, then got on a ship that had been a troop ship, and taken back to the States with two destroyer escorts. They were still going like that, back and forth across the Pacific, I guess for some fear that there might be submarines, even though the European war was almost over by that time. But the Japanese war was still going on. So we landed near Los Angeles, met up with a family that my folks had gotten to know before the war. And before long, we were on a train heading back to the States. My parents both grew up in a tiny town of Clymer, New York, in the very western corner of New York State. And my dad was the youngest of 7, so there were uncles and aunts and cousins and so on, and my brother and I memorized them all. That's one of the things we did in internment camp. So there was great rejoicing. As we were coming across the country on this train, I remember my brother and I getting up, it was a Union Pacific train, and there was an observation car, and this country really is beautiful. And out west of the mountains first, and then the plains, and my dad said if the Japanese had any idea of the size, of this country, they never would have bombed Pearl Harbor to begin with, but anyway, finish the rest of life history. Okay, so I was still about 8 and a half or so by that time. We stayed in the States for a year, and then my folks decided to go back to the Philippines for another, it was going to be another 5-year tour of duty. However, after about 3 years, in 1949, my dad developed severe back problems. He had a lot of pain, and he went to Manila and diagnosed, and finally decided he needed surgery back in the States. And so we decided to come back due to my dad's back problem. And about the same time as we were getting ready to make that move, my mother developed heart problem. None of this had anything to do with our internment experience. My mother's heart problem came from rheumatic fever that she had as a child. We came back to the States. My dad had a very successful spinal fusion operation in New York City. But my mother's heart problem never did get better, and so they decided not to go back to complete their tour of duty after 1949. So my dad took a church in Edinburgh, Pennsylvania. My brother and I both went to the College of Worcester in Ohio, later Penn State, where I met the lovely, smart, vivacious, captivating Miss Randleman, North Carolina, 1959. Not too long after, 2 years, I got a degree, 2 years postdoc in Washington, D.C. and came to Lafayette in 1965, and that was a long time ago. Okay. Any questions, anybody? Please. I'll pass around. This is a picture of us in Montelupa after we were liberated. You know, we were not skin and bones. We were not as emaciated as some of the pictures in these books of internees, and certainly not like military war prisoners.
David?
And here are pictures of us after we got back.
Okay, I have two questions for you. The first is, where is the map from? Where?
My dad got this somewhere probably down here in Mindanao. And this was after, between 1946 and 1949, so we did some traveling around. Yeah, so, you know, this is called Celebes Sea. Celebes is now called something else, now it's part of Indonesia, and so on. Second question.
Yeah, was there any awareness among the folks who were interred there on the how grand the scope of the war was? I mean, you guys were in this sort of one little place. Did you guys have any idea of what was going on around?
Well, there were some. The thing is, there were a lot of rumors, okay? And so there were a lot of fake news, you say, mixed in with the real stuff. But internees did develop some skill at filtering the good stuff. Whether there was an internee named Darley Downs who was fluent in Japanese. And then there were other Japanese guards who spoke some English. And so there would be some words. So apparently they knew when the Battle of Midway was fought. And I think there was some awareness in the camp, from my dad's account, that the U.S. was winning the War of the Pacific. You know, the question was MacArthur and the troops going to get to us in time? That was the big problem. But no, there was some intelligence. There were also, I mean, there were rumors that we were going to be executed. I don't think this was widely, you know, these books try to make this, you know, it's very dramatic, of course, and the idea was, you know, these people were all going to be executed, you know, and you know, so on. But I don't think that was widely believed. There were some people around, and Japanese guards were set to digging a particular deep trench one part of the camp, and some people thought, well, maybe that was going to be for us, but it could also very well have been part of the system that existed. Danny?
Is it fair to say that the Filipinos were treated much differently than the Americans and other Caucasians?
Well, it's certainly different from us. There's really no explanation. If you read this, I read this book. It's 500 pages, and it's just hundreds of pages of accounts of atrocities. Why? So I think that first place, David could probably tell you better than I. The Japanese military had a different philosophy. I think dying with honor was something that was widely expected.